Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. In this seminar, we will discuss Gabriel Marcel's essay on the sacred in the technological age. All right, a brief overview here of what we're going to be getting into in regard to this essay. So first off, we want to make sure we understand Marcel's definition of the sacred. And by the way, of course, Gabriel Marcel is the last great French existentialist. Gabriel Marcel is a Catholic philosopher, and so many people in the academic world disregard his philosophizing, but he's actually very brilliant, and his work is very important. It actually clarifies and fixes a good number of ideas brought forth by Jean-Paul Sartre, and he's the last existentialist that I deal with in my 2-volume set, What is Existentialism? So I encourage you to take a look at it. I'll try to remember to put a link in the description for the book. There's a good number of ideas that are just sort of left hanging after you read the early Heidegger or Jean-Paul Sartre in regard to existentialism. And Gabriel Marcel does a great job of tying up those loose ends and actually shining a lot of light and providing a significant amount of insight into how to coherently understand some of these ideas that are otherwise fragmented or not fully developed in the earlier existentialists. His work in the philosophy of technology is wonderful, and this is a really interesting article, and so it's also quite appropriate for today. Written in the 1960s. So what we're going to see as we go through this overview is his definition of the sacred, then his definition of technology. Specifically, what is technocratic thinking? The technological mediation of procreation. I really wanted to push forward this idea of technological mediation as a philosophical concept. It's present in, especially Gabriel Marcel, but it's present in previous generations of philosophers of technology, but no one had seemed to concretize it into a kind of philosophical concept or a theme for philosophy of technology. And so that's really what I was hoping to do. We're going to take a look at this concept of technological mediation, specifically of procreation, in Gabriel Marcel's essay. We're going to look at the distinction between theocentric versus anthropocentric production, the reduction of the being of family. Gabriel Marcel does a wonderful job of articulating ontologies of community, and really his work has inspired me to think about ontologies of community in ways that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily be prompted to think by thinkers like, for example, Heidegger or Sartre. So, for example, familial identity and the meaning of life, the world as consolation for the children of broken families, paternity as vocation, and life as an infinitely precious gift. We'll also be looking at the right to manipulate life by mediating our relation to the sacred. Technology attacks life. This is one of Marcel's theses from this essay. The reduction of the sacred to the contractual, the sacred relation versus the business relation, statistics as a technologically mediated, inauthentic self-identification. What is conversion from the technocratic perspective? So again, I'll put links in the description, and if you want to understand Marcel, especially as Marcel relates to what I have explicated as the core concepts of existentialism, that's helpful because then you can see how the other existentialists, actually tracing this all the way back to Kant, how the other existentialists relate to those core concepts. Then you're able to see Gabriel Marcel's philosophy in the light of specifically existential philosophy or existentialism. So hopefully you'll take a look at that and spread the word. I think it's some of my best work. I really am happy with how this turned out. So Yeah, 1962. So The Sacred in the Technological Age by Gabriel Marcel. So it was first published in 1962, and Marcel tells us here, I'm going to go ahead and read the very beginning, what he identifies as the problem. So he says, the problem to which I would like to devote my attention here is a most serious one. Considered in its broadest context, rather than in a strictly religious one, it is perhaps the most important problem which can confront a man today, or can confront us today, even if he is an agnostic or an unbeliever. It finally boils down to the question of what modern man, controlled as he is more and more by a technology which he himself has invented, is making of himself. So that's the problem that he hopes to identify with this essay titled The Sacred in the Technological Age. All right, here's his definition of the sacred. It is possible that in the last analysis, this something may appear philosophically as related to holiness, to the holiness of God, but such a relation is by no means self-evident. In fact, I think that we should consider here the experience of the sacred such as it might present itself to men who are not believers, or more exactly to men who do not think of themselves as believers. Thus, the sacred may have something to do with holiness and the holiness of God, but Marcel wants to talk about this philosophically, not religiously. So here's the definition of technology. When we speak of technology, we do not mean a cumulative unity which would be obtained by adding together all existing techniques. We are thinking rather of human reason as it applies itself to what we might call the parceling out or organization of the earth, of life on earth, and we might add today of other planets and of life on other planets, even though at this moment that is but a possibility which we cannot be sure will be realized. So I'm going to continue reading this to you, but this definition of technology by Marcel, I would say that it is in line with Heidegger's definition of technology. So I'm in the process also of finalizing a presentation on Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology, but for now we can say that Marcel's definition of technology is in line with Heidegger's. Under these conditions, to say that man is led to think of himself and of the world in technical terms means, first of all, that he sees the world as capable of being transformed methodically by industrious human activity. This actually traces all the way back to Descartes again. I know I'm always kicking Descartes, but it is actually true. I believe it's in the Discourse on Method, in which he says that the hope is that we will be able to dominate nature. He suggests here that we see the world as capable of being transformed methodically by industrious human activity until it should more and more completely satisfy human needs. Marcel predicts, in agreement with Gunther Anders, that one day we will look back on humans before the advent of technology and think of them as outdated, worn-out stuff. And that's a direct quote. I believe that there is some deep sense in which that's already happened, right? So sitting here 60 years later, after the writing of this essay, two, that human thought, this is another quote, that, quote, human thought in its practical use will be chiefly directed toward fixing the supposed imperfections of nature, end quote. This seems to be the case from both points of view, right? From perhaps all points of view nowadays. It kind of seems like, well, what we need to do is to use technology to fix whatever it is that we're identifying as the problem. We're going to get to how Marcel talks about this in general in a second. And then lastly, this includes, according to Marcel, sexuality. Okay, so what is technocratic thinking? So the definition here of technocracy, the government or control of society or industry by an elite of technical experts. An instance or application of technocracy of elite technical experts. So I'm reading Marcel to you. Innumerable examples come to mind. I think particularly of the new contraceptive devices which were invented a few years ago, and which seemed to guarantee to human beings the mastery of a function which until then had been governed by chance, blindly and in a way which many advanced thinkers thought to be contrary to the true interests of the species and of the individual. So he's speaking to Bill Gates from the grave in a sense also, right? I will merely observe that in the perspective of a technocracy, such mastery cannot be considered as anything other than desirable. Only it implies a postulate which can doubtless be considered as questionable. I shall come back to this point later. So on the previous slide, we saw that human thought in its practical use will be chiefly directed toward fixing the supposed imperfections of nature, and that this is technocratic thinking. So, seeking to use technology to solve the world's problems, underdeveloped countries can be fixed through the use of technology, and that nothing should stand in the way of technological evolution. So that is technocratic thinking. The technological mediation of procreation. For instance, as regards the question of contraception, to which I referred earlier, we must take account of the objections to the use of contraceptives which are advanced by many religious people and especially Catholics. To these people, the use of contraceptives seems to imply not only a misunderstanding, but the very negation of a certain sacred aspect of life. For reasons which we should try to make explicit and understandable, the genetic function is regarded by religious people as being in nature very different from the other biological functions. In fact, I think that from that point of view, even the term genetic function can be considered as open to criticism. I'm sure some of you were already thinking that with what I was reading earlier. To speak of genetic function is in a way already to devaluate the act of procreation, to strip it of that which, in the eyes of the believer, gives it its particular value. One might say its transcendence. What is important, and perhaps the only thing that is important, is the fact that in the act of conceiving, a man and a woman are but fulfilling the conditions necessary for the incarnation of a human being, who, as such, is an image of God. After the moment of conception, what really matters is the gift which emanates from God, and which human beings should be ready to respect. It seems to me that it is only by the recognition of this gift that it becomes possible to attribute to life, or more exactly to the transmission of life, a character of sacredness. So this is the idea of technological mediation in regard to procreation. We also identified technocratic thinking, and now we're going to see how technocratic thinking applies to procreation. I think that it's important to just toss in these historical labels here, that though Marcel is talking about modern humanity, I think that there's clearly a sense in which we are now dealing with postmodern humanity, and that's post in parentheses. All right. So lastly then, here in regard to technological mediation of procreation, the manipulation of life which is inherent in any contraceptive act seems to imply that this gift is disregarded, and that man considers himself no longer as the mediator but the maker. Now let us observe that the act of mediation is closely related to the act of creation. In fact, it is to be suggested that any activity we regard as creative in man should be considered as intercessional, that we are merely mediating God's creation. We're the mediators between God and nature. This is also a Buddhist idea. This idea appears prominent in Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind as well. He tells us we should always keep this in mind. We must not hesitate to recognize that man, due to the progress of science and of technology, has placed himself in a situation which tends to favor the substitution of production for mediation. We may even go so far as to say that in today's, or perhaps tomorrow's world, everything seems to happen as if such a substitution were justified, so that it takes a painful effort to resist the current and to try to recapture the now covered up datum, which is mediation. I mean, I'm certain that there are groups that are able to accomplish this. They're not groups that are going to be watching videos on YouTube, but the idea of being without some of the technology that we use regularly is a strange idea now. It's a strange idea. And I'm of the forgotten generation, as they say. And so I span these moments. So I was an adult in a world without this technology, and now I'm an adult in the world with the technology. So I remember what it was like to, not have the internet. So theocentric versus anthropocentric. Marcel asks, shouldn't we resist the theocentric interpretation of procreation, right? Shouldn't we resist it? Shouldn't we have the courage to recognize that the procreative act belongs to humans and to humans alone? Marcel emphasizes the idea of production in regard to procreation. He emphasizes that it should not be confused with industrial production, right? For example, as a mode of production. So here's a quote from Marcel: "The act of procreation can in no way be compared to a manufacturing process," though I think that especially with some of the things that are going on now, that it absolutely is being thought of as a manufacturing process in post-modernity. Marcel suggests the act of procreation is mysterious in that, quote, "the man doesn't know what he is doing," end quote. And this is in contrast to the rationalized process of manufacturing a product, in which the phases of the process are known explicitly and capable of manipulation, guided by rationality. I wrote an article on designer babies and the process and how people were doing this already just outside of the United States. So they would have a doctor who had an office both in the United States and outside of the United States, and then they would fly to this office outside of the United States to be able to go through the procedure. And it was fascinating. One of the things I used to talk about in the classroom a lot, how fascinating what it was that people were striving to produce. And they wanted to produce blonde-haired, green-eyed females. That's just fascinating. I mean, that's just the statistics bearing out, right? So anyway, when we think about this nowadays, it seems as though, and I hope to put a video about designer babies and this together here in the future. But when we think about this, especially with some of we're like right at the edge with the CRISPR technology has been around forever at this point, it seems like, but we're right at the edge with some of the things that we're able to do with stem cells and so on and so forth, and cloning and such. So, and now, of course, this huge surge of artificial intelligence. So it will be very interesting to see what happens in this area. But philosophically speaking, Marcel is spot on when he says that this is being thought of by way of technological mediation. Like once you have the technology that you can mediate the process, such that then you can control the process, you can then control nature. Once you have that, then it becomes a very short step to think of this as a kind of production, just like industrial production of any kind of product. We're gonna 3D print something, right? And that there is a rational process behind it, that we truly will just be able to engineer whatever it is that we want. Okay. This is in contrast to the rationalized process of manufacturing a product, in which the phases of the process are known explicitly and capable of manipulation, guided by rationality. So here is this sense in which as technological mediation of procreation increases, Marcel is suggesting that the mysterious aspect of conception is vanishing, it's disappearing. At this point, however, you might justly ask, is it not entirely arbitrary to wish to interpret this opaqueness of the procreative act as the sign of something sacred, right? So it's mysterious. Why does it have to be sacred? Would it not be more natural to see in this opaqueness a simple expression of the fact that man's roots are by nature embedded in impenetrable darkness, his vocation being precisely to liberate himself as much as possible from this darkness in order to arrive at the light of reason? And that is Enlightenment philosophy, that is Descartes. Indeed, I do not think that this objection can be, strictly speaking, refuted, or more exactly, if it is possible to disprove it, it is only by way of a long detour and by making the sacred connote the spiritual. To put it in slightly different terms, even if one day paleontological discoveries should make it possible for us to uncover what we call our origins, those origins would in no way be enlightening, for significance becomes lost as we make our way back into prehistory. This does not mean that our origins cannot be illuminated, but illumination can come only from a light that has its source elsewhere. I'm thinking of, often these articles are suggested to us by Google, and they'll have a picture of, some sort of a Neanderthal or something along these lines, and they'll say, this is your ancestor. And I'm wondering, maybe someone will do it now, right? But I'm wondering how many people print that picture out and hang it on the wall, right? Like, that's my ancestor. And we still must retain the idea that there exists a fundamental difference between production and procreation. The procreator is essentially a mediator, but he mediates between a past and a future which equally escape him. As we consider our own entry into the world, however, it becomes possible to find room for the sacred, as is shown by all the religions that have included a cult of ancestors. But independently of any sociological inquiry, we should also take account of the conditions which make for rootedness in the family environment, right? So what makes someone your ancestor that you would put on the wall as opposed to the Neanderthal? This quote here comes from Heidegger's Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, and I really appreciate this quote, and I think that it's appropriate here, so I wanted to include it. Dasein's being in the world is essentially constituted by being with, even when factically no other is present at hand or perceived. Even Dasein's being alone is being with in the world. So these are the questions that are being asked and the insights that are being highlighted as we work out this distinction between a theocentric versus an anthropocentric point of view. All right, so the reduction of the being of family. What is much more important, paternal authority is being progressively doubted and questioned by the very people who should be exercising it. So this declaration from Marcel shouldn't be heard as a kind of dog whistle. Rather, it should be heard as indicating a symptom of how the technological age relates to the sacred, here considering family to be sacred. So we can ask, has the primacy of familial identity taken a back seat to a more social and worldly identity in the technological age? I think that this is something that everyone can ask themselves, but it certainly seems like in general the encouragement is to see yourself in terms of the global theater of politics. Identify yourself in terms of that theater and identify yourself in terms of whatever your global politics are, and not identify yourself as a child of your parents, or not identify yourself as as belonging to a line or a tradition of individuals, your ancestors, or not as a child of God. So I think that this question is appropriate, especially when we're asking things like, how does your identification of yourself, the background context within which you are identifying yourself, how does that influence the meaning making in regard to life? Or how does that influence how you determine the meaning of life? This is a question that I discuss in the 2-volume set, What is Existentialism, as well, by the way. So when you ask yourself, do you have a good life? Or when you evaluate your life at all, how do you think of yourself? These are good questions, I think, for us to ponder. Do you think of yourself in terms of the world or in terms of your family? Now, the world as consolation for the children of broken families. So 2 ways the world can function as consolation. 1, if broken, and 2, if no alternative, for example, no familial presence. So I guess what we're speaking to here is this idea that, well, so now what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say that family's good and the world is bad? And this sort of black and white either or thinking? No, I don't think that that's necessarily what's being said. So let's hear Marcel on this. So this is how it may be thought that, for example, technology now substitutes for the role of the parent and the role of the family. So you see this often, whether we start talking about dopamine and so on and so forth, we see this often, this idea of parents just sort of handing tablets, gaming equipment and such. This use of technology as a means to mediate the parent's relation to the child. I think at one point in time there was this sense in which psychology was supposed to give us this, this is all based in technocratic thinking, right? But that psychology was supposed to give us some sort of technology or techniques by way of which we could speak to children such that then, we would be able to control their development. And this is all technocratic thinking. But now it seems as though we've shifted as technology in terms of, its physical manifestation has increased. Now it seems as though we've just shifted over to this idea of just using devices to technologically mediate the relation as opposed to techniques. And of course, some people claim that this is linked to autism. This is commonplace now. So the question that Marcel is asking that this is relevant to is, has technology somehow substituted for the role of the parent in the family? So though this sounds like a moral declaration, it could also be a declaration regarding the power of technology over humans. Lastly then here, paternity as vocation or as a calling, and life as an infinitely precious gift. According to Marcel, he says that paternity in the full sense of the word should not be thought of in biological terms, but rather as being inseparable from a certain vocation. But this attitude itself presupposes a reverent attitude toward life. It implies a postulate which perhaps is not fully apprehended, but which states that the expression "to give life" should be interpreted in the widest sense. That life is an infinitely precious gift, and that in any case the Father is himself but a mediator between God, who is the basis of all creation, and the child, who is a creature of God. But it is precisely at this point that the process of desacralization about which I spoke takes place. Life is considered less and less as a benefit. This is fascinating. I believe that he is correct. That men of today are much more inclined to emphasize whatever is absurd and hopeless in life. And from this follows the consequence that parents think of themselves as having, without justification, brought into the world a being who never asked to live, who did not ask to participate in this incomprehensible and all too often sinister game in which they themselves are engaged. One certainly gets this perception from doom scrolling, right? This is another aspect, and philosophically the most important one, of the problem I touched upon before in connection with contraceptives. It is only when one sees life in a wholly pessimistic perspective, or a perspective that has a diminished sense of the sacred, that one comes to treat it as a simple mode of energy, which must be mastered and whose harmful effects must be reduced. So again, this is technocratic thinking. So now the right to manipulate life. So the shift from the theocentric to the anthropocentric worldview has stripped the sacred attributes from life. And in general, we could say that this shift occurs with modernity. So modern philosophy and modern thinking brings this in. And again, Descartes is explicit about this as well. I mean, Descartes could be read as expressing a hope that we would be able to get to here at some point. But now we've gone beyond this modern into a space of the postmodern, and just problems abound, as it were. But so the point here is that we have shifted from a theocentric to an anthropocentric point of view or worldview. So the feeling of the sacred, the feeling, depends on, quote, an order of things in which the subject finds himself in the presence of something which he is totally unable to grasp. Okay, so that accounts for the feeling of the sacred. With technology, our focus becomes the grasping of more and more. So technology in this way dehumanizes. Here we see Marcel talking not only about the ontological but also about the soteriological. And so I'm gonna put together a video on or a series of videos on posthumanism and transhumanism. All right, so next, in regard to the right to manipulate life, one of the unique features of Marcel's existential philosophy is that he offers an articulation of what is diminished or lost by way of the increasingly technological age. So this is soteriological. Marcel criticizes Freudian psychoanalysis as providing a worldview based on technique, and thereby away from a worldview capable of experiencing sacredness. Jung in this context is interesting, a return to shamanic pre-technique methods and a capacity to experience the sacred, right? So here we have this sense in which Marcel, Jung, Heidegger, Jacques Ellul, that all of these thinkers are standing together in a sense. So lastly, procreation does not equal production, for example, as we mentioned in regard to designer babies. So Marcel is highlighting this idea of what right do we have, or what is the right to manipulate life. By mediating our relation to the sacred, technology, according to Marcel, attacks life. The word sacred loses its meaning. It degenerates into a vague adjective once we stop admitting that it refers to a reality which transcends absolutely the level of simple psychological dispositions. And I think that there are just so many psychologists, even ones working for seminaries, who are psychologistic and have lost sight of this. Thus, we are brought to recognize that in a world where technology is given absolute primacy, there inevitably develops a process of desacralization, which attacks life and all its manifestations, and which attacks especially the family and everything connected with it. So again, this technocratic thinking attacks life, according to Gabriel Marcel. It's an attack on life. The reduction of the sacred to the contractual. Again, we're explicating this essay by Marcel. The reduction of the sacred to the fascist, profit ultimately determines the meaning of interactions, gain as the means to happiness, right? The reduction of the sacred to the fascist. The reduction of the sacred to the utilitarian. So we have the reduction of the sacred to the fascist, we have the reduction of the sacred to the utilitarian, in which contractual arrangements ultimately determine the meaning of interactions, contracts for everyone's own good, which everyone tries to exploit. Lastly here, then we have the reduction of the sacred to the bureaucratic. So rules ultimately determine the meaning of interactions, red tape, processes, which everyone tries to circumvent. These are quotes from Marcel. The sacred relation versus the business relation. So if we say that the reduction of the sacred to the contractual looks like this is what the sacred relation looks like in contrast to the business relation. It is this sort of degradation which makes bureaucracy everywhere resemble a kind of generalized cancer, the cure for which is very hard, if not downright impossible, to find. At best, one can devise temporary remedies here and there, but it will be obvious to anyone who thinks that such a solution grows every day more complicated and is in itself related to the growth of the population. So here we see then the technological age is understood as fascist, utilitarian, bureaucratic, and technocratic. And again, this is coming from a conservative point of view. I think that it's important to see that. So lastly then, statistics as a technologically mediated, inauthentic self-identification. Notice we talked earlier about one could identify oneself with the family. So here we hear Marcel say, I think the following is clear enough, namely that whenever we try, as we must, to find some solutions to the innumerable practical problems which arise out of mere number and because of numbers, we find ourselves willy-nilly in the domain of statistics. Now, it seems to me that the domain is one in which the sacred cannot possibly exist. For in statistics, there is a kind of absolute indifference toward the individual. In statistics, there is a kind of absolute indifference toward the individual. So we can think of this as the postmodern care of the self, that we are supposed to think of the self in terms of statistics and statistically care for the self. I'm thinking of, interestingly enough, because we have the Matthew, for those who have the ears for it, but I'm thinking of the Nietzsche quote where he says that it is a mistake to live by this idea of, or this philosophy of survive at all costs. He says this idea that to survive at all costs is a mistake. I think that he is correct. And in other places, I talk about this in the What is Existentialism 2-volume set, but in other places we hear Gabriel Marcel talk about life as a creative sacrifice. So instead of this idea that, death is coming and we need to use our technology to hold it off and get as much pleasure as we can in the process, or as much gain and as much control and power and dominance in the process. Rather, there is a sense in which we could say, how are we using our life in terms of a kind of sacrifice for others? And this is not to be thought of as in utilitarian terms, but I fear I'm beginning to digress now. So let's get back into this postmodern care of the self. So interestingly, Matthew 16:26, we hear, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? All right, so what is conversion from the technocratic perspective? What we should stress here is that conversion is, first of all, the movement by which consciousness turns away from the insistent and oppressive spectacle which is offered by the world when seen in a technocratic perspective. Put another way, conversion is the movement by which the consciousness transcends the obsession of number, of the innumerable objects in the midst of which it appears to itself as paltry to the point of non-existence. This is FOMO. This is the feeling of, that one gets of meaninglessness from doom scrolling, but also the feeling that one gets by comparing oneself, for example, to these technological machines, this sense in which Once you combine capital with some of the technology that's available, in the face of this, it's like, David and Goliath, for example. So finally, the quality of inwardness is here recovered by an act which we should not just qualify as free, but which we should say is freedom itself. So this conversion back to a theocentric worldview, this conversion away from technological mediation, this conversion to see technological mediation in the correct light. I think that this is becoming more and more difficult. Perhaps we're already past the point of no return. I feel as though even as I say these things, that so many people might hear them and just think, well, that's just not possible, or there are just too many benefits, right? That it makes no sense, or it's absurd to try to call for. I mean, it's like saying something like you're going to enter into a conflict, you're going to bring a knife to a gunfight. You know what I mean? So, it's like I recognize that now. So he's writing in 1962, and he's French. That's meaningful, but I still believe that to lose sight of the theocentric worldview is to lose the correct and appropriate context for understanding technological mediation. And the problem with that is that it goes right back to this idea of the care of the self, the identification with the world, the identification with statistics, that then it changes, existentially speaking, for example, it changes our relation to death. It absolutely changes our relation to death. And insofar as, existentially speaking, our relation to death is fundamental, it's the point around which our philosophy of life crystallizes, then we should understand that this is no small bit of philosophy here. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I really do appreciate you. We'll see you in the next seminar.